also like to thank those joining us online. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. And before I introduce Sean, I just have a few thank yous. First, to the Manchester Historical Society, a gem of an organization in our community. The programming they have provided in partnership with Green Mountain Academy is, well, local history at its best, and we are grateful. I would also like to thank the Southern Vermont Arts Center for hosting this talk on their beautiful campus and for their support as a partner. I hope you frequent the galleries here. And to GNAT, they are managing the live stream, and they record this talk so that our friends near and far can enjoy a program such as this and keep lifelong learning accessible to all. Thank you, GNAT. I have one request, and that is to silence your cell phones. And now our presenter is Sean Harrington. He serves as curator of the Manchester Historical Society and of the Heritage Committee at Aquanic Country Club in Manchester. He is also a trustee for the Dellwood Cemetery Association, for the Love of Vermont, the Lyman Orton Collection, the Southern Vermont Arts Center, and an advisory board member of the Wilson House in East Dorset. Sean's professional life is as a registered investment advisor representative with Bay Colony Advisors in Concord, Massachusetts, with over 25 years of experience in financial services and portfolio management. Sean lives in Manchester with his fiancée Bonnie and their children. Sean, it's always a pleasure to work with you. Please join me in welcoming Sean Harrington.
So, thanks everybody. Before we get going, actually, Amelia, the Executive Director of the Art Center, just had a couple things she wanted to share with you, so I'm just going to step back for one more quick moment.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's great to see this auditorium filled. Thank you, Gloria and Green Mountain Academy. Thank you, Manchester Historical. Tonight's talk is in celebration of America's semi-quincentennial, and that celebration continues on our campus through Saturday when Taconic Music presents its Pops Orchestra program here on July 4th at 7:30 p.m. So I welcome you to join us again on Saturday, and also to come back for our series of upcoming talks throughout the summer. There's a bookmark on your seat with those, but I'll just call out quickly our July 18th talk on Kentucky Derby fashion with photographer Lily Kobielski, our July 24th talk on the Art Center's great artists, and Sean Harrington will be returning later this fall, he has promised me. If you haven't yet seen the Art Center's new building, I encourage you to walk over after tonight's talk. The galleries and curate are open until 8 p.m. And now, thank you. I'll pass it to Sean.
All right, thank you everybody. Can everybody hear me pretty well? Yep. Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is really, seriously, good evening everybody. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Amelia. You know, thanks to all the supporters of the Historical Society and the Art Center for hosting us here tonight. You know, tonight we're kicking off the 250th anniversary events, and I want to take you back in time a little bit. You know, as we just came in out of the steamy North Shire Valley, you know, we see a very manicured landscape of paved roads and historic architecture. But back in the 1760s and 70s, the people who arrived here, you know, they faced basically a pristine, unbroken, and unforgiving wilderness. You know, they didn't come up here on horses and carriages. They came here with oxen to pull stumps, carrying everything they owned, just trying to carve out a life in this valley between the Taconic and the Green Mountains. But the elements were their only battle. Over the next, I'm hoping an hour, so maybe an hour and 10 minutes. You know, we're going to trace the history of Manchester from its earliest settlement up to, well, kind of today. So with a lot of stops along the way in the historical timeline. So in the mid-18th century, Royal Governor Benning Wentworth of New Hampshire granted 135 townships, including Manchester in 1761, across a territory that was simultaneously claimed by New York. You know, this is a copy of Manchester Charter from 1761. This is actually over at the New Hampshire State Archives. You know, to encourage the settlement, These townships in the New Hampshire grants, or just the grants, you'll hear me use those terms a lot, were typically divided into 64 equal shares of 100 acres each and sold to proprietors for nominal fees at pretty cheap prices. He also kept a little for himself and to his friends. The charters mandated that a certain amount of land had to be cultivated over time, and the tall white pines would be reserved for the Royal Navy's use as masts, and that there would be a glebe land set aside to pay taxes to the Church of England. So he was doing all he could to kind of, get in favor with the king. In the case of Manchester, none of the original grantees ever settled here. Instead, the proprietors, who were often just land speculators residing in Connecticut, Massachusetts, or New York, sold their rights, especially to a group to settle these lands, who were mostly down in the Armenia, New York, and the surrounding areas. Now, if you're like me, I had no idea where Armenia, New York was when I first started doing it. So where is it? So for us to jump in a car, it's a little over 2 hours. And if you were walking up here, probably anywhere from a week to 2 weeks, very long days, if you're walking in colonial America across paths and what would be called roads back then. So when the settlers arrived here, they came into a landscape that was pretty much completely forested. So, it would have been the men only at first. They would have come up here, leaving the families behind as they tried to carve out a place for a homestead, out of this wilderness during the summer months. This is one of the earliest maps. It was called, I love some of the titles. A couple times I'm going to read off the titles. It's called The Most Inhabited Part of New England. And it dates to about 1774. It was updated a couple times by English geographer Thomas Jeffries. So the New Hampshire grants, as Vermont was known at the time, is circled in red. For you people who are sitting up farther away, can't really see the screen, just trust me, right in the middle, there's a big red circle. And the arrows coming up from the south are from Armenia, from south on their way up to Manchester. So clearing the lands for the crops and the hay fields was backbreaking work. And, the reality shaped those animals. I said they brought oxen up here because horses eat. I'm sure there's a few people here that have an equestrian background. Horses eat a lot. And when you're coming up to a forest, well, there's no hay fields. You can't order hay. You have to make sure that it's going to be here. So horses weren't here for the first few years. It would have been oxen, and they don't move very fast. So that's what they would have had. They would have basically camped, and they would have probably had to forage for the food they had, which was full of wildlife. As I mentioned, our township is 6 square. For those of you sitting back there, it's just squares. And it's 6 square miles. Sometimes when I think about driving around Manchester, it's only 6 square miles. It was divided up into 100-acre lots. And, the lands, there's one little spot there in the center that says lands not granted. So he didn't just lay out the entire state. It was done in, over the course of time. Some of the names: Martin Powell, Gideon Ormsby, Timothy Meade, Samuel Rose, William Marsh, John Roberts, Jeremiah French. These are some names I'll be repeating throughout this talk, were some of the early proprietors, their names appearing frequently in all the early town meeting records from the 1760s and 70s. These influential men served the community as diligently as they possibly could. So this is a rendering that I did what Main Street in Manchester Village probably looked like in the 1770s. Not really a lot happening compared to today. But the tavern that was built by William Marsh was a bit of an anomaly in its size and the materials used to build it. He built it about 1769. And it was located, where the southern end of the Equinox Hotel stands for today. And, just to bring you up to speed, in case, you've been driving by it all this years, the Equinox is 2 very different hotels. This is southern part. So when I say Marsh Tavern stood under the southern half, this is the southern half. This was built in 1839 by Martin Vanderlip, was known as Vanderlip's Hotel. The north end, which is much different with the Belvedere dormers on top, this was opened in 1853. And today the whole property is known as the Equinox Resort, but when it opened in 1853, it was just the Equinox House, and Franklin Orvis is the one who opened it. So anyway, just try to give you a little bit of perspective. So back in the 1770s, life was a bit simpler on the surface, but certainly there were a lot of storms brewing on the horizon. So the name of this talk is Farmers' Fathers to Green Mountain Boys. And, the families that were here, they were just trying to carve a living out of the land. And, clearing the lands, building, planting, harvesting, preparing for winter. Winters were no better then than they are now, maybe even a little worse. Raising children, which often included 6 to 12 kids, maybe more, sometimes less. This was the primary focus for those early settlers of Manchester, and for that matter, southwestern Vermont as a whole. So, but, starting in the 1770s, the New Yorkers, or as they were called, Yorkers, began showing up on the grants with their own land claims, and they were trying to run off those early settlers who had been clearing lands over the past few years, and sometimes they used force and intimidation. Now, one of the things, so we are at the Arts Center, and I do have the honor of serving as a trustee, so I'm going to throw a little art in this talk. So this is a great piece. It's actually at the Rutland Post Office on West Street that was painted in 1937 and was funded by the Treasury Relief Art Project. And the artist is Stephen Belaski of Bellows Falls. And the scene depicts the Breckenridge standoff, which occurred in July of 1771 down in Bennington. So that was basically when an Albany sheriff showed up with a posse of 300 men and attempted to seize the farm of James Breckenridge, and under basically a New York eviction order. So he was met by a wall of defiance led by a local militia. Their leaders were Ethan Allen and Remember Baker. They were basically outmaneuvered and outwitted, and without a shot being fired, the New Yorkers were forced to retreat. But this showdown that they had there, the Breckenridge farm standoff, effectively broke New York's judicial authority west of the Green Mountains. And this really galvanized the settlers' resistance to the New Yorkers coming in, trying to lay claims. And it earned the site kind of, it is legacy today as the birthplace of Vermont. It's kind of down by the Henry Bridge in Bennington, if you've been down there. And a little more artwork from the Rutland Post Office. And, it's interesting. We don't know what Ethan Allen looked like, or Seth Warner, or any of these people, because no portrait survived from their lifetime. But on the left, you'll see Ethan Allen. In the center is a rendering of the Green Mountain Boys, and on the right is a Yorker, or a land claimant standing there with his hand up. So when New York tried to take their land, the local towns started forming their own militias. New York called the first one, first militia, they were kind of the Bennington Mob, or the Mob. But by 1772, they were probably calling themselves the Green Mountain Boys. They didn't just protest, they burned out the New York settlers until the governor literally sentenced the leaders to death. But Ethan Allen, ever witty that he was and brilliant, he declared that they were fighting for liberty, property, and life. I mean, they love to make the declarations, tying their local land wars, kind of directly to America's struggle for independence. I mean, he was pretty aware of what was happening down with the Sons of Liberty and happening in Boston. And, tensions really started boiling over in 1774 and 75, and anyone supporting New York faced severe retaliation from the boys. For merely criticizing the Green Mountain Boys, there's a wealthy landowner named Dr. Samuel Adams, not the Samuel Adams from down in Boston, and he was tied to a chair, hoisted up in front of the Catamount Tavern signpost in Bennington, and he sat up there for hours to public ridicule. But, his punishment was kind of mild compared to what they did to Benjamin Ho, who was jailed. He was tied to a tree, whipped 200 times, and permanently banished from the grants. So this etching was originally, I love this, this etching was originally published in 1853 in a book titled Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, Heroes of '76, with a sketch of the early history of Vermont. I mean, really researching this has been, an absolute treat for me. So we're up to 1775. Tensions are escalating. Elsewhere in the colonies, especially Boston, the Sons of Liberty, the aforementioned Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Paul Revere, Benedict Arnold. The Battle of Lexington-Concord fought on, April 19th, 1775 marked the official outbreak of armed conflict between the colonies and the British. And, it was initiated by the British regulars marching from Boston to seize colonial military supplies. So the engagement began with the anonymous shot heard round the world on Lexington Green before culminating in a tactical British retreat under heavy colonial militia fire. But up here, what were we doing up here in the grants? Well, Ethan Allen got wind of this. They knew about Ticonderoga, and he sprang into action. And, he called the boys together and mustered, and right about that time, Benedict Arnold showed up because he had the same thing in mind. It had been sent north by the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. And begrudgingly, it depends on the accounts you read, they did go up to Ticonderoga together. They marched up for a surprise dawn raid on March 10th, and as they came up through in small groups, they didn't just march up in one big column because they were trying to do this covertly. They would have passed through Manchester, and they would have been picking up men along the way. And this is an etching, a wooden etching from 1858. And, so sure enough, he captured Fort Ticonderoga. And it served as our first, offensive military action of the war. And, when they seized the fort, they didn't know they were coming. They had no idea. You know, the British garrison that was there, they didn't know what happened down in Lexington and Concord. So that's why Allen and Arnold were in such a hurry to get up there. So they went in and they basically woke the commander up and said, you know, surrender. So, you know, but what was important there, which they were after, was the cannons. And those cannons they got, you know, during the winter of 75, 76, you know, basically Colonel Henry Knox oversaw the movement of this heavy artillery, about 60 tons. And he had to drag these cannons from Fort Ticonderoga 300 miles to Washington and Boston. And, you know, they set them up, you know, on Dorchester Heights in 1776 and basically effectively forced the British to evacuate Boston in March of 1776. So there was a lot of good that came of that raid on Ticonderoga, or the capture of. So who were the Green Mountain Boys? Well, we don't have any pictures, but I can tell you where a few of them are buried. And you know, in our local cemeteries here in Manchester, in Delwood, we have a couple, and this is John Roberts. You know, he's one of Manchester's forefather. He was a man described with massive physical stature. He was one of the original boys, and he served in Seth Warner's regiment later. Roberts and his 5 sons participated in Allen's expedition to Fort Ticonderoga. His son Christopher was actually supposedly one of the guides and was the third man into the fort. You know, John would also go up to Montreal with General Montgomery in 1775, and he was actually taken prisoner up there, and he was later pardoned and released by Governor General Carleton. His sons, Benjamin, John, William, were all in the battles of Hubbardton and Bennington. Peter was at Hubbardton, Bennington, and Saratoga. You know, and not only did he have 5 sons, but he also had 2 daughters with his wife, Susanna. Christopher, who I just mentioned, you know, who's buried near his father at Delwood, you know, he was also at Hubbardton and Bennington, except for at Bennington, he was in charge of basically moving the women and children, which was very important because, you know, the crossfire of the civilians, you know, it was keeping the wives and the kids safe. He moved them down to Massachusetts because they didn't know what was going to happen. And he ended up rising to the rank of general in the Vermont militia. And, you know, he and his wife, Mary, they raised 11 children. 11 children. You know, another one of our residents in Delwood is Major Gideon Ormsby. You know, he had 8 kids with his wife Mercy. He's really a foundational figure in Manchester. You know, he was one of the settlers, land speculator, Green Mountain Boy, very dedicated leader to the militia, vehemently against the New York mob, as they called them. You know, he rose through the ranks and served on the Committee of Safety. You know, and as I noted, he was in relentless pursuit of the Tories, and they absolutely despised him. You know, there were numerous times when they tried to go to his house and either kidnap him. They actually kidnapped his son at one point, tortured, you know, would harass his family and his wife when he was away. You know, but he was also an active participant in the Dorset Conventions, which I'll talk about, which helped establish Vermont's independence. And, you know, he was held in really high regards, you know, including by the governor, and was appointed to, you know, the Strategic Committee in 1781 to defend Vermont's frontiers. And he was a Jeffersonian Democrat and remained very vocal in his political beliefs all the way up until his death. So he lived down on a large farm, which is now known as Skinner Hollow Farm, just a little bit south here. And the inn at Ormsby Hill, Edward Isham actually named Ormsby Hill for Gideon Ormsby, but that's not where he lived. And Isham was actually the law partner of Robert Todd Lincoln, and one of the many reasons that Lincoln actually came here. And this is the farm. So when I say, well, he's just south, just a little bit, this is actually the Skinner Hollow Farm, or if you might like, it's the Ormsby Farm, which is just about 600 acres. It has been in the Severance family for 4 generations since 1950. 75 years ago, just about today, actually, is when Peggy Beckwith sold it to my friend Eric's grandfather. And this photo was taken by Emily, who has a great photography business. Anyway, a little plug. I said, do you have any pictures of the farmhouse? So this is the farmhouse when you're driving south. So this is where Gideon lived. And in our collection, we have this great piece, which is a colonial era musket. The gentleman, Mr. Robert Parker, who lived up in Maine, he donated this to the Historical Society. It actually belonged to his ancestor, Gideon Ormsby. It was crafted in Goshen, New York, sometime between 1777 and 1779. It was made by a gunsmith named John Dowd. It's much longer. If I used actually the whole picture of it, you wouldn't be able to see anything. And just a special thanks again to, Terry Tyler. Ted Hopkins built us a beautiful case for it, and the former president, Dick Smith, they really helped secure this donation. And I get to bring it out quite often, and it's down in the archives at the library. So if you want to come see it, just come see me, and I'd be happy to show it to you. So what happened to Ethan Allen? Right? So this is actually a signature off a document that's in our collection that Susie Isham Hardiman, who was the granddaughter of Edward Isham, gave to the Historical Society in 1965. We really do keep everything that you all give to us. And so what happened, so not too long, so you figure, so May is when they went to Ticonderoga. They actually had a convention at Cephas Kent's Tavern in Dorset on July 27th, just a little while later. And the men voted by a margin of 41-5 to elect Seth Warner as their lieutenant colonel over Ethan Allen. He was deeply hurt. Actually he wrote later with clear frustration, how the old men came to reject me. I cannot conceive inasmuch as I saved them from the encroachments of New York. So, I mean, he was widely viewed as rash and impulsive, especially following, his attempts to take Fort St. John, which ended really poorly, and only a couple of weeks after Fort Ticonderoga. In contrast, Seth Warner, they had a common cousin, which was Remember Baker, was seen as a much steadier, more disciplined, and even-tempered leader, and inspired confidence among the ranks. So here Ethan Allen was, the hero of Vermont, or of the Grants at the time, had taken Ticonderoga, and basically the boys voted him out just a couple months later. And, what happened to him? Well, he was captured by British forces, just in September 25th. He went up there, he attempted to take Montreal with a small group of volunteers, and, well, it didn't work out so well. So he was taken prisoner, and he was taken over to England, and he was at a castle over there near Falmouth, and he was brought back to America. He was kind of a celebrity over there. And then when he came back here, he was down in New York, and it was various places on a prison ship. He was in irons, basically. And he was released from a prisoner exchange in 1778. So he really missed all the excitement that we're going to talk about here, over the next couple of years. But he did write a book about his experiences. So here's one of those things I would say, it's the book cover there. So this was the title of his book. I have to actually read this up because no way I could remember this. Ethan Allen, a narrative of Colonel Ethan Allen's captivity from the time of his being taken by British near Montreal on the 25th day of September in the year 1775 to the time of his exchange on the 6th day of May 1778, containing his voyages and travels, interspersed with some political observations, written by himself and now published for the information of the curious in all nations, 1779. I mean, that's the title of a book, right? So here we are, 1776, right? We're at the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So how was that received up here in Vermont? Well, we really don't have any idea, which kind of makes sense. There was no newspapers in Vermont in 1776. The settlers basically relied on word of mouth, some correspondence, occasional lot of state newspapers. The first Vermont newspaper didn't appear until 1781. The clearest immediate reaction I found was it happened at what we know as Mount Independence today in Orwell. So the news of the Declaration reported there, reached there around July 18th, and the colonel, later General Arthur St. Clair, he read it to the troops that were there, and they changed the name. I don't know what the name of it was beforehand, but they honored the post as named Mount Independence in honor of the July 4th, the Declaration of Independence. Otherwise, I really, I even did a newspapers.com, search 17, we didn't have a lot of newspapers, but there was 20 articles, and I think, wow, I grew up thinking, well, everybody would have known it, but it really wasn't quite as far and widespread as we may look back on it and believe. At least that's just been my experience of doing the research. So I mentioned the Cephas Kent Tavern, which is pictured here in 1925, and it's at the foot of Nichols Hill Road and Dorset West Road, on Dorset West Road. And, with everything happening in the Revolution and decades of, and almost a decade of bitter land disputes with New York, the conventions of 1776, they laid the groundwork, which became the independent Republic of Vermont. And, at the tavern, these gatherings brought together delegates from the various towns. There were figures like Thomas Chittenden, Ira Allen, Jonas Fay, Gideon Ormsby was there, Seth Warner. And, they had, they had kind of a dual purpose. There was to unify the region's military defense against the British forces, while also organizing political resistance to New York, and then Congress completely ignoring us because New York was so powerful they didn't really want to recognize that we were even there. So it was a little bit of a balancing act. And this is what the Kent Tavern looks like today, or it's what it looked like about 3 days ago. And during the July 24th session, basically they came up and kind of drafted what would become, our Constitution. And as they're trying to explain what their plight to Congress, Congress is just the Continental Congress down in Philadelphia, they're basically kind of ignoring us because New York is saying, no way are they going to get in here. That's our land, and then we had the boys torturing the New Yorkers. So, I mean, basically out of that, the stated mission was to be for the safety and liberties of the colonies in general and the New Hampshire grants in particular. That was kind of a statement they came up with on that day. And, just a quick PS, this home actually would become the home of Lincoln Isham. And Lincoln was Robert Todd's grandson. And it was also the home of Dorset painter and Southern Vermont Art Center founder, Dean Fawcett. So at this very home. So it's just wonderful. There's a marble marker out there, and you guys can't really see it, but there's a forerunner there with my dog sticking his head out the window. Right there by that marble marker, which has been kind of altered a couple times, but it kind of tells the story of the Kent Tavern. And I just wanted to use this picture because this view just always takes my breath away when you turn around at the foot of Nichols Hill Road and look back towards Mount Aeolus. This localized focus, it basically evolved into a definitive political rupture between, and it was one of the most consequential sessions, and that really galvanize them that they need to move forward. And how do we define ourselves going forward? And it would continue on. And Jonas Fay was tapped to basically start putting together our own Declaration of Independence of sorts. And the delegates kind of went back home, and like I said, they still had, while all this is happening, they still had to make sure that there was going to be food for the winter because they were still here. So this wasn't a full-time job. Just like our legislature today is not a full-time job. Well, it certainly wasn't a full-time job back then either. So in 1777, this is kind of the year that the tide turns for the American Revolution, and the New Hampshire grants really become an independent republic. So, the name Vermont. So there was a move to actually call us, instead of the New Hampshire grants, New Connecticut. And in January 1777, when the delegates of the grants met to declare their independence from both Great Britain and New York, they originally voted to call themselves New Connecticut. But there was a problem because there was a section in northwestern Pennsylvania along the Susquehanna River that was already widely referred to as New Connecticut, which was causing confusion. And then Dr. Young printed this broadside letter in April 1777, who was a very close friend and kind of a political mentor to Ethan Allen. And he was living in Philadelphia at the time and working along radicals like some of you probably have heard of Thomas Paine. And Young was deeply invested in helping the families make a living here and legitimize their territory and basically push New York sovereignty out of the grants for good. So he published this open letter, this famous letter, to the settlers on April 11, 1777, to give the recognized republic a distinct, prestigious identity. Honoring its famous militia, the Green Mountain Boys, he coined a brand new name on a combination of French words, vert, green, and mont, mountain, Vermont. Makes a lot of sense. So his letter was boldly headlined, "To the inhabitants of Vermont, a free and independent state." So the name caught on. And, so a few months later in June 1777, when the delegates got together again in Windsor to kind of formally draft the Constitution, they dropped the New Connecticut. So can you imagine if we would have been New Connecticut? I mean, I guess. But there were much bigger movements kind of afoot. British General Burgoyne was on the move. He moved south from St. John's. And this kind of demonstrates, where he went. On basically starting around July 2nd through the 6th, they basically surrounded the Americans. The Americans basically evacuated forced Ticonderoga and Mount Independence without firing a shot. It was about 4,000 men, and about 550 of them were sick. And they weren't really set up. I mean, there's a whole, I'm sure you could find, there's going to be a lot of good talks coming up. You could go visit Ticonderoga, it's wonderful. But their commander, I mentioned before, General Arthur Sinclair, he called the Council of War, and he just couldn't see a way out. So basically he abandoned Ticonderoga. And while they were leaving, Warner went towards Hubbardton, and rather than just making his way right back here like Manchester, he stopped and he wanted to rest his boys for the night. So on July 7th, his detachment of about 1,200 men, they were acting kind of as rear guard, and they were surprised and overtaken by the British. And it was good because it slowed the British down, but it was considered, it was kind of considered a loss by the Americans. And the British forces, they basically overwhelmed the boys. And Warner kind of had to limp back here to Manchester the following days. And so over the course of the next couple months, we had several thousand troops marching through this town. I mean, it's kind of astonishing to think about, especially in the days after Hubbardton. As they retreated, some of the Americans went down, they set up in Fort Anne, and, a British detachment went after them, and then, they moved back and basically they burned everything and so the British wouldn't have anything. And if you go up to Hubbardton today, what's interesting, which I didn't know, this is actually an etching of the obelisk that's there. It was erected on July 7th of 1859, 82 years after the battle. It's about 21 feet tall. It is recognized as one of the oldest Revolutionary War battle monuments in the United States. And it's still there. There's a picture that I took last year. There's a picture of my two boys actually standing about 10 years ago. And on one side of it, it features a direct summarization, to its leader. Colonel Warner commanded, Colonel Francis was killed, Colonel Hale was captured, and the Green Mountain Boys fought bravely. So even though they were overwhelmed and it's considered a loss, they actually slowed the British down, and they all came back here to Manchester. So this news was big news here in Manchester, and the legislation, they just come up with the Constitution of Vermont. And literally, news hits that Burgoyne is on the move, and what are they going to do? So they disbanded from Windsor, and one of the first places they came back was to Manchester. They put together a Council of Safety, and by July 8th, they were formally established, and they were here in Manchester. Probably there were a couple different taverns, but Marsh Tavern, the Weller Tavern, which is further down Main Street, and that's how they governed. And with Burgoyne on the march, there was really no time to wait and fully, for a full legislature to organize. And what's cool is in our collection, we have this document that was written on July 11th. And it really captures the town, at a time that, things were looking a little bleak here in the grants in Vermont. The Americans had lost Fort Ticonderoga. Hubbardton had just happened. The Council of Safety was here in Manchester trying to set everything up. Jonas Fay, this document shows that, that our town was acting as a nerve center, for the new Republic of Vermont. He was coordinating secret military intelligence, directing the militias, and bracing for what they thought was that the British were going to come here and try to finish off Warner. And, when St. Clair came back into Dorset on his way back, he stopped at his friend Colonel William Marsh's home. And his home was just over the border in Dorset. And he was a friend of all these early settlers, the Manchester forefathers. And, he stopped there. He sent out numerous messages from there to Manchester and it's just unbelievable. Marsh turned Tory about a week later. It was very complicated, why he turned Tory. And I'll tell you this little story here coming up. This is kind of a rendering of what the tavern might have looked like on the 15th of July, 1777. And, as they were trying to figure out how are they going to pay for it's money. I mean, the militia was there. They did fight for land, but they also needed to get paid. So how was the Vermont Republic going to pay the militia? Well, they confiscated the Tory lands. The Tories, the Tories and the Loyalists, which I use a lot, which they were still loyal to the king. It was hard in this small community because a lot of people said, why do we want to give up? We have the protection. Why are we fighting against the British? And there were people saying, we need our liberty. And then there was the people who they were most scared of, which they didn't know which side they were on. They could have gone either way. But it was Ira Allen's idea, basically, to start confiscating the lands of the Tories so that way they could raise money. And Howard Wilcox actually shared some of these documents that he collected from his Aunt Grace, who was a descendant of Enoch Eastman. And his farm is Independence Farm. It's kind of the second big farm on Route 30 when you go out past, when you start getting on the flats near the Harmon Mint. And I don't think these documents have seen the light of day as far as I know. So on July 15th, this document is an official military warrant issued in Manchester by Council of Safety, explicitly directing Enoch Eastman to recruit 50 Rangers to serve under Colonel Seth Warner. It's signed by Ira Allen and Jonas Fay. The order guarantees a specific financial bounty or pay for the enlisted men serving as direct surviving evidence of the council's proceedings in Manchester, and all the active efforts they were making to fund the local militias. That same day, this is a document for his official commission from the Council of Safety, appointing him first lieutenant in Captain John Warner's company of Rangers. And this document is signed by Thomas Chittenden and Ira Allen. So we can get a good idea of who was here in Manchester and what they were doing. So basically the nucleus of the Vermont Republic was here in Manchester, in July of '77. And he was going to serve under the regiment of Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Herrick, for a 6-month term. These documents, I look at them and I just think, how consequential that all ended up being. And, and these are just glimpses we have. When I go back a couple slides, thankfully we have, kind of the records, but they're still sporadic because, there weren't newspapers reporting on this. They weren't recording everything. They were just trying to survive. There was nobody there making notes. There were no reporters there. This was all happening. They were making notes, and some of the documents happened to survive that were in the personal possessions and have made it down through the generations and maybe ended up here at the Manchester Historical Society. So it's pretty exciting. And then this document, which is actually hanging on the wall down at the Bennington Museum, was penned by Seth Warner from here in Manchester on July the 20th, '77. And basically it's an urgent plea for reinforcements to New Hampshire. He more or less said, I'll just make it in easy language, he said, your state's militia forces have been delayed. We need immediate help from anything we can get. Because of the emergency, we are begging you to send troops forward as fast as possible. About 4,000 enemy troops are currently stationed at Castleton. This was the information he had at the time. And they plan to march down through the New Hampshire grants starting today. They are also moving with heavy artillery cannons. So this urgent call went out to Massachusetts and Connecticut. And, and his call was answered. John Stark of New Hampshire, he had served at Bunker Hill. He raised a force of 1,492 men in 6 days in New Hampshire. What a little interesting things. Some of this stuff, I have a little bibliography here for you. Like this book that Phil Holland wrote on the Battle of Bennington. It's not, actually he did 2 editions. The one is newly revised. Great books if you want to kind of read more about this. And it was interesting because part of the pay for the New Hampshire militia was rum. So their canteens were full of rum. But yeah, so he came here. 6 days he raises this militia, and he starts off from Manchester and arrived here in early, August. And his advance guard was here basically on August 2nd. So, so you had Warner, and men are kind of coming in, after Hubbardton, men are still, coming into Manchester and setting up camp and trying to figure out which end is up. It must have been terribly confusing, but they basically knew what was happening. Stark shows up, and, the Continentals had set up Benjamin Lincoln, set him up here, and basically he said, okay, so I'm in command of everybody, and Stark said, no way. Lincoln wisely deferred to Stark. He did reporting for insubordination, but he did know better than to kind of get it his way. And, as they recognized what was happening, because, Burgoyne, so here's a nice portrait of Burgoyne. He really made, kind of a fateful decision to send an expeditionary force under Lieutenant Colonel, his name was Frederick Baum, to Bennington. And it boiled down to a shift in priorities. He needed food, horses, supplies, basically. And he actually listened, he didn't really see Seth Warner as kind of the battered remnants of the regiment reorganizing in Manchester. He didn't see that as an immediate threat because he needed to continue down the Hudson River corridor. So rather than committing his main column, to hunt down these retreating militia deep in the Green Mountains, he sent Baum's expedition, as a diversion. And, originally, they were going to go over as far as Rockingham, and they were going to forage heavily, come back, try to recruit more loyalists before looping back to rejoin the main army near Albany. So, but those plans, while he was drafting all this, there's a gentleman who kind of comes into the story here. He was a prominent loyalist named Philip Skeen, and he had a little area up at the tip of Champlain called Skeensboro. It's actually Whitehall, New York now, named after himself. And there was a former Green Mountain boy who had turned loyalist, Justice Sherwood, and they assured him there was a massive, poorly defended Continental Supply depot down in Bennington, very poorly supported. And basically, Burgoyne took the bait, so to speak. He listened to them and said, okay, well, instead of going to Manchester and over through Rockingham and doing this big sweeping thing, why don't you just go to Bennington? So he altered his route. And, so there was a number of days of skirmishes as they were coming down. Stark headed off for Bennington. Warner went ahead of his troops. The regiment was still here. And, there was a big rainstorm on August 15th. Everybody was wet. That's when the original engagement was going to start. And then the skies cleared on the afternoon of August 16th. And Stark utilized his superior numbers, and he executed kind of a brilliant double-pronged envelopment strategy, dividing his forces. He launched a multi-sided attack against Colonel Baum, who was entrenched up top. Then they also had, the Loyalists had their own their own area of the battlefield, and they basically overwhelmed them. They had several hundred Canadian Loyalist volunteers there. Many of them were from towns, Manchester, Sunderland, Arlington. They were looking basically across the field at Green Mountain boys and members of the militia coming who they had actually been friends with. They had been part of town government with. And even to the point where some of Herrick's, those volunteers like Enoch Eastman, where they actually there was a card they would put into their hats, and they were acting as loyalists, kind of creeping across the field, in twos and threes to go meet up with a loyalist. So it became a very personal fight, hand to hand. And after that first wave kind of went through, this is a 1780 drawing of that. After this first wave, the trap was sprung at 3 o'clock and everything happened, and it was a tremendous clap of thunder. And what happened, the Loyalists got overwhelmed. They basically ran. Most of them were captured, and the natives that were there with them, actually, they fled. The remaining German regulars on the high ground tried to defend their redoubt fiercely until their ammunition was exhausted, and Colonel Baum was basically mortally wounded. And following that victory, the story is American discipline wavered. the militia broke ranks, distracted by the spoils of war. Did I mention the rum? Well. So the British were carrying rum as well. So, as I read, it was like, okay, so they found the rum and they started getting into the rum. And, but thankfully, Seth Warner, they had left Manchester and they marched, and like as Hollywood, if they're listening, they arrived on the field in the nick of time. On their way, they stopped through Stark's camp in Bennington, and they also got a couple of shots of rum on their way in. So, so when Warner's troops showed up on the battlefield and did their charge, they had a little rum in them. But basically, as a result of Warner's action, even though the militia was in disarray when he got there, there was another 650 fresh troops of Germans coming in, and basically that last clash basically sealed the fate of the entire British efforts. So it was amazing. Warner's disciplined men and the Green Mountain Boys immediately engaged the forces. They blunted the German advance. This allowed Stark to rally all his disorganized men, also ultimately forcing them to retreat and securing an enormous victory in the Northern Theater. It's very difficult to tell all the moving parts of how important the Battle of Bennington was, just for me. There's going to be a lot of talks coming up. Next year's at 250 after that. And if you find my little butchered talk about the Battle of Bennington interesting, please go, because these could be 2-hour talks just on the battle. So I'm just trying to give you a quick overview of what happened. But what were the results? Burgoyne lost 907 men, 207 killed, roughly 700 missing or captured, which amounted to about 1/6 of his entire army. By contrast, the American forces, we lost 30 men killed. It's still 30 men by all means, 30 men killed and 40 or 42 wounded. quite a lopsided battle. And we had a lot of prisoners. I mean, this mural, you can actually go down to see this at the Bennington Museum. It was painted during the it was painted by Leroy Williams during the Great Depression for the Works Progress Administration. And it's a beautiful mural that you can go down there. And it's titled "The Prisoners Taken at the Battle of Bennington," and it shows the Catamount Tavern, that gambrel roofed house over on the upper right, and the boys and some of the prisoners. And there's a whole talk just on this one painting. And for me, one of the great things that came out of this was, General Burgoyne wrote this. He said, "The New Hampshire grants, in particular, a country unpeopled and almost unknown in the last war, now abounds in the most active and most rebellious race on the continent, and hangs like a gathering storm on my left." I mean, what an endorsement. Hold on just one second. Yeah. What's up? I'm not drinking rum. This is water. As I mentioned, I'm on the advisory board of the Wilson House of East Dorset, so I stopped drinking rum a long time ago. So that gathering storm, so a little art break here for us, but recognizing that his left flank was entirely exposed to these hostile, fast-moving locals, Burgoyne realized that his campaign was in severe jeopardy. So at Saratoga, and it was basically two major engagements: on Freeman's Farm on September 19th and Bemis Heights on October 7th in 77. This stands as a decisive turning point for the American Revolution. So after a series of clashes depleted his forces and prevented him from receiving more reinforcements, Burgoyne was surrounded, and he was forced to surrender his entire army to American General Horatio Gates on October 17th. So, following that pivotal role in saving, basically, that American victory in Bennington, and Warner and his regiment of Green Mountain Boys, they marched to New York to join the Saratoga campaign. And he was, Warner was heavily involved with cutting off the British retreat lines, and was famously reported as saying that he was so constantly on alert during the encirclements of Burgoyne's army that he never took his boots off for 17 days and nights leading up to the surrender. So the reason why you're saying, what do you have this picture up here for? So this is actually a sketch that was done by artist John Trumbull. And he began conceptualizing his Revolutionary War series in 1785. And in 1791, he actually came to Saratoga, to basically sketch the site of where the surrender had taken. Decades later, after receiving a formal commission from the United States Congress in 1817, he used all those early studies that he did to execute his monumental 12-foot by 18-foot oil painting that hangs in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. The final painting was completed almost exactly 30 years later after his initial sketch, which we see here in December 1821. And if you've been to the Capitol Rotunda, this is the final work that actually hangs hangs there. 12 by 18 feet. I mean, that's an enormous work. And this is the scene of the surrender of British General John Burgoyne at Saratoga. He surrendered and offered his sword to Horatio Gates, who actually refused to take it. Very gentlemanly back then. And, Burgoyne, he treated him as a gentleman and invited him into his tent. But, the Saratoga campaign, Hubbardton, Bennington, Saratoga, how important was it? Right here. I mean, we're, Bennington, what do you think about, Saratoga? We probably all drive by it on our way over there. You can see the monument over there behind the apple orchard. You should go over there and check it out sometime. It's actually really interesting. There's one whole section that's actually empty. They have these statuaries, and there's one that's empty because, Benedict Arnold was there too. So he's sort of represented, but not there. But, what it did, it demonstrated to the world that this little continental army that we had could stand up against and defeat a major British force. And it basically persuaded King Louis XVI of France to sign a formal treaty of alliance with the United States. And, this alliance brought all the financial and military support, and particularly the naval power, which ultimately proved to be indispensable and, led to the final victory in 1781. And, one other thing, kind of back to Enoch Eastman, I found this other thing, which is just a little rabbit hole for me. And this is in 1778, and this is another military commission for him that was issued in Arlington, Vermont, and signed by Thomas Chittenden. And one of the signatures caught my eye, and it's Matthew Lyon. And Matthew Lyon was actually imprisoned in 1798 under the Sedition Act for publishing fierce criticism against then President John Adams. So he was actually put in prison for 4 months in Vergennes, Vermont. And he actually has kind of the unique distinction of winning re-election to Congress while he was in a prison cell. So, us Vermonters, I have to say, right? So yeah, what about the wives? Right? I mean, as I go through all this, a lot of it is written about the men, and a lot of the things I've shared to you is about. So, it's a great question. Thank you, everybody, for asking. I mentioned, as kind of a little bit of a preview, about the wives and the children of those few Green Mountain boys that I covered tonight. So I just wanted to pause for a moment, just for a little bit of perspective about those women, because they're the ones that held this whole thing together. This illustration is actually from 1885 about the brief history of the United States. And, during the 1770s, and I looked this up and did as much research as I could, the women of Manchester bore the full burden of frontier survival. This was a buckskin town. I mean, this was the frontier. I mean, we always think of Kentucky and, the Wild West, but man, Manchester, Vermont, there was nothing going on here. I mean, it was a wild town. And, not only did you have the loyalists and the threats, and maybe the British were coming. Well, when I'm talking about all these militias going off to fight, well, who do you think's at home? The wives are at home. So, they basically had to manage everything while their husbands were away. The subsistence of the farms, they had to make sure that the fields kept clear. They had to plant the crops. They had to tend to the livestock. They had to raise the multiple children, in the harsh wilderness. There was no medical. They didn't go to urgent care down across from the bookstore. I mean, they faced constant anxiety from the threat of not only from the British, but from the loyalists, their neighbors. I mean, Gideon Ormsby alone. I mean, Mercy, his wife. I mean, it was some of the anecdotal stories that have survived, which she had to put up with, and and they also had to defend their homes. It's a deeply divided community. So just the sheer resilience and the physical labor that that they had to exert to keep the town's early settlement from completely collapsing. So, in the future, maybe I do need to do a talk on the Green Mountain Girls, right? I think. What do you think? The Green Mountain Girls? So, Gloria, take note. So, and I've used that term, the Tory loyalists. So, as we look back, we think, well, we're Vermont, and I've told these stories, how unified we were and how unified we are today. But, when Burgoyne began that campaign, it was, a lot of very practical, very influential men in town, they made a very calculated choice to remain loyal to the crown. Political loyalties go deep. I don't know if you've heard about that recently, but it's true. And, some things don't change. History repeats itself. I say that over and over. In the East Dorset Cemetery, I mentioned a little about William Marsh. So the Marsh Tavern, associated with the Council of Safety, Well, here's his gravestone, and it's a very unique gravestone because it has both a United Empire Loyalist badge and a Sons of the American Revolution badge. So it's the resting place of Colonel William Marsh, and it bears the epitaph, "He whose virtues merited a temple can now scarce fund a tomb." And, this is kind of a little bit closer up. Marsh was probably one of the most vital and maybe overlooked leaders of Vermont's of the Revolutionary era. Before the war, his tavern, on the southern wing of the Equinox, where that is today, was a gathering place for friends. It's where where town business was handled. It's where the council. It's basically where Vermont's government met for a few weeks. There's a great book right here that you can get at the bookstore. I think you can get it at the bookstore. Hopefully you can. Called Colonel Marsh, Vermont Patriot and Loyalist by Jennifer Brown and Wilson Brown, a husband and wife. And they wrote this, I think it was in 2014. That tells, so this whole book I'm going to explain to you in three short panels. And Marsh was friends with all these people, but he was caught between both worlds. He was so disillusioned by the Continental Congress's refusal to recognize Vermont. He was just appalled. And he wasn't really happy with he was friends with the Green Mountain boys, a lot of the boys he was friends with. But he was kind of embarrassed of the way some of them behaved and how brutal they were, because he considered himself a gentleman. And what he viewed as a true enemy was New York. So he couldn't figure out, like, why are we fighting against the British? New York's our enemy. We should stay loyal to the crown. So this is a very complex legacy for a man. He was a patriot and he was a loyalist. As a trusted supporter, as I mentioned, General St. Clair, after he left Ticonderoga, one of the first places he stopped was at Marsh's house. He was there. He's right, telling him, we don't have any records of what he said, but he was there for a number of days, so the conversation, wouldn't it be great to have a recording of it, but, so he would have heard all this and heard of what happened in Hubbardton and the anxieties and the fears that were happening with Burgoyne coming down through and what was going to happen to Vermont, and the fact that New York was still blocking most of our recognition or sending up real continental troops to help us. It was militia that won the Battle of Bennington. It wasn't continental troops. It was militia. New Hampshire and Vermont militia. So he was really shocked. So basically, in early July, St. Clair's there, he ends up going to Manchester. Everything happens in August, they start going down to. And Marsh had to do some soul searching, and he left. He basically went to Skenesborough, and he formally defected to the British. But that still, his allegiance, his loyalty remained to Vermont. He wanted Vermont to survive. He wanted us to be our own republic. So it's a very complicated story, and his properties were confiscated. Once it came out, it was with great joy that they auctioned off all of his lands that were left in Manchester. They auctioned off. He was kind of smart because he put his Dorset properties in his wife's name, so they couldn't auction that. And he basically died, and he died in 1818. He outlived everybody. And he lived right across, he lived just over, he never came back into Manchester from what I understand. He lived just over the border. And this is where he lived. So many of us, our beloved Chanticleer, which is no longer there, this is right across the street. So buried under all of that is actually, and in the back there's this old salt box that dates to about 1775, and then this large colonial home, which underneath all the siding and everything and the picture windows, that was Marsh's home. And that's where he lived. So you can you imagine how St. Clair must have felt, when he came into Manchester, then and they find out that Marsh had turned Tory. Just the betrayal they must have felt. But, his allegiances were to Vermont. Marsh had married Sarah Ann French, who was a daughter of another loyalist, Jeremiah French. And the couple, they had 12 children. So she's there when he's in all this trouble and goes up to Canada. She's still there in Dorset with 12 kids that she's raising. And, was kind of a bit of a pariah at the time, because the neighbors are still there. So that marriage, Marsh was stuck literally between, the influential Tory circles and, which certainly factored heavily into his decision. And, I'm going to show this. This is actually a uniform that's in the Canadian War Museum. And this actually belonged to Marsh's father-in-law, Jeremiah French. Another person considering a founding father, very prominent civic leader, is in a lot of our early town records. Major landowner in Manchester. Had 9 kids with his wife, Elizabeth, and following his decision to side with the crown. French was at the Battle of Bennington with the Loyalists. He was captured at the Battle of Bennington. Can you imagine what the conversations must have been like? And when the Loyalists were, the Hessians, they were kind of treated okay, but the Loyalists who were captured, they were not treated very well at all. They were basically all tied together and, forced to march back to Bennington. And he was held as prisoner until 1780. This is where it kind of gets interesting. So in 1780, French was released in a prisoner exchange. Who orchestrated this prisoner exchange? Remember I mentioned Justice Sherwood, who said it was a good idea for them to go down to Bennington because it was lightly defended. Well, Sherwood actually was part of, let's do this prisoner exchange. Who else was in the background? William Marsh. So Marsh certainly wanted to get his father-in-law out of prison. But what also happened during all this was, some talk was going on. Well, what if this doesn't go so well? Because they didn't know which way this was going to go. Could the Continental Army ultimately beat the British Empire? Did we want to be our own colony? Was New York ever going to free us? Could we be our own republic? So, there was kind of a covert channel of communication that was opened with the Canadian British governor. His name was General Frederick Haldeman. And, some of other Marsh's lands, all of his lands in Manchester were, confiscated, including this home, which is on Main Street, just a little south of Manchester. Rich and Martha are here, back there. That's their home. This home was also, the home of, our own kind of unofficial poet laureate and author and Johnny Appleseed bookstore keeper, Walter Hard. And, his home is still there. And he also owned the 1811 house at the time. That was his inn. And, numerous lands. All of that was confiscated, and the money's used to pay the militias. And, as I said, that covert channel that I mentioned, it would become known as the Haldeman Affair. And it was basically a series of diplomatic negotiations conducted between 1780 and 1783. Ethan Allen was out of prison by then. So do you think he was involved in that? Oh, yes, he was. He and his brother. This is actually a portrait of Haldeman. And again, frustrated by the Continental Congress's, their repeated refusal. We tried to say, hey, let us in. No, because New York was like, So it was very hostile because the land claims, because the New Yorkers were still showing up here, still, so that was still going on all the way up through this time. And plus, we were in trouble because, the British could come through and they could wipe out, even though the Saratoga had happened, they were still, right up in Quebec. They could have sent skirmish. It's not like everything was connected. They could have come down and burned Vermont to the ground and then gone back to Canada before anybody really knew what hit them. So this correspondence is basically what was happening. Long story short, and breaking down this entire book, the Vermonters, Thomas Chittenden, both the Allen brothers, Marsh, all of them, was it a big basic bluff? Well, if things don't go right, maybe we'll be our own republic. We'll come back with the British crown. Using that as a little bit of leverage, why should, we want to be part of the colonies. We want to be kind of the 14th colony. If you don't want us, maybe Canada would take us, which would essentially mean us becoming a British province. So this exchange went on for the course of 3 years. And, Congress still refused to recognize our independence. And, ultimately it fizzled out. Well, because Cornwallis, he surrendered to Washington at Yorktown. So basically when all that ended, everything went gone. It's like, well, we were never negotiating. We always wanted to be a part of the colonies. But in hindsight, it was brilliant because at the time they didn't know which way it was going to go. And ultimately, they wanted to protect Vermont and protect the Vermont interests. So it was high stake. Now, the Allens would have made a lot of money. There's a great book here written by Kevin Graffadino, if you have a chance to read it. This I know you can get at the bookstore for sure, about Ira Allen. And it covers a lot of this of, what the Allens were, who were the Allens and what were they doing. They owned a lot of land up in northern Vermont. They owned land down here, they lived down here, but they also had a lot of land. So if we did become a province or stayed loyal, they would have done very well because they would have been a trading partner. Anyway, another talk. Great book to read. So the Republic of Vermont. Right, so 1791, we make our, here's our Constitution, which was, basically unilaterally adopted in Windsor on July 8th, 1777, and then of course, as I told you earlier, July 11th they were down here in Committee of Safety, and it was basically, they put it together, they heard Burgoyne was coming, and everybody scattered. So the Constitution basically bypassed any kind of popular vote from the people in the grants, and everything went to this emergency authority of the Council of Safety. So as you can imagine, that was sharply divided. There were towns that were aligned with the Green Mountain Boys and the independence movements, and they loved the idea that we had a new government and that we were going to be kind of masters of our own destiny. And some of the things in our Constitution, such as universal manhood suffrage, explicit abolition of adult slavery, not slavery of children, adult slavery, but that was a first. But the community, especially down in the southeastern part of Vermont, particularly Windham County, they vehemently rejected, the legitimacy of the Vermont, of the Republic of Vermont, and they stayed loyal to New York, which sparked years of civil unrest. And, they organized resistance to taxation. There were clashes between the Yorker sympathizers and the boys. I mean, the boys went over, so by then they were known as the Green Mountain Rangers. This is kind of the uniforms they wore. And, in the 1780s, I mean, it kind of reached a boiling point in 1782 when Ethan, went over there with a detachment of the boys to, basically put down, this uprising, this violent uprising that was happening in Guilford. And, it resulted in, property confiscations, banishments, and, these little armed skirmishes. So it wasn't all Shangri-La either for Vermont once we became a republic. It was still very deeply divided between should we be loyal to the crown or to New York and people who recognize New York's authority, or to Vermont. And none of it was ever voted on because everything else had happened. So New York continued to block our entry into the United States. Congress refused to recognize our sovereignty. And depending on where you were in Vermont, you never knew if you were going to walk in and see a friend or a foe, and sometimes your friends became foes. So it wasn't an easy road. But, business did carry on. Ira Allen, this is our Great Seal, the basis for the one that we have now. This was adopted in 1779. That tall tree in the middle, that pine tree, it was basically, framed as the people say the pine tree, represented freedom for the King of England. Freedom and unity, our motto, reminds us to protect our freedom, but we must also work together as a state. It's still our motto. And that tree, it was in Arlington, right on 313, about 3/4 of a mile down 313 from Route 7. And there is actually a marker there. Honestly, I've never noticed it. But, Bonnie's sitting here. She said, "Hey, yeah, it's there." and the story, it was actually a huge tree back when, when Allen used it as his inspiration. But it did blow down in a storm in 1978. But, this marker does mark about where it was. So next time you're driving down 313 heading towards Saratoga, take note. And I'm just going to go down a little bit of a hole. So as a little plea for the Manchester Historical Society. So apparently when the tree fell down, they cut out these sections and gave them out as souvenirs. So if anybody has one of these, come see me. I really want one for our collection. So, back to that flag that's in the opening slide, the Green Mountain Boys flag or the Vermont flag. But it's actually the Stark flag. Actually, it was General John Stark's of New Hampshire. It was military historians generally accept that his troops fought under the specific green and blue banner with 13 stars representing the 13 colonies. And then the boys kind of adopted it. The Green Mountain Boys adopted it, and it was for a brief period our primary, during operational use from 77 to 79, and still observed unofficially as the Vermont Republic flag. They changed it. This was a flag that we used from about 1804 to the 1830s. I mean, I don't think it's very unique. In the 1830s, we went to, this design, which they kind of updated the logo. And then in 1923, we adopted the flag we kind of know today. So just kind of carrying through, the logo still survives to today. That pine tree is still there, But finally, in 1791, we were admitted as the 14th state. Kentucky was the 15th state, so Congress authorized a 15-star banner. So we never got a 14-star flag. That's actually a 15-star that you can see in the background there. So I just wanted to share this little story with you all. The Reverend Dr. Nathan Perkins, who was a Yale and Princeton graduate, and he lived down in East Hartford, Connecticut, he made a horseback tour through Vermont in the spring of 1789, just a couple years before we were admitted as the 14th state. And so he published a journal recording his impressions of Manchester as a town. Hemmed in by lofty mountains, populated by half-Baptists, and famously described it as a loose town. We had a lot of taverns. I can tell you from reading the history, we had a lot of taverns. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of people who had taverns. All Main Street, when you drive down Main Street, a lot of those houses that go back, a lot of them were taverns at one time or another. So I did a little bit of research, And and by the way, he also passed Ethan Allen's grave up there in Burlington, and he remarked that he was an awful infidel, one of ye wickedest men ever walked this guilty globe. Anyway, so he wasn't a big fan. So I looked, I said, okay, so what were these guys drinking? You know, they weren't going down and buying a bottle of Jack Daniels at you know, a discount beverage. But so there's a drink that they drink which is called the Stone Fence. So, which was a legendary choice of the Green Mountain Boys. I found it from a number of things. I mean, I looked it up on the internet, so it's got to be true, right? So it's called the Stone Fence, and it was famously libated the night before the raid on Ticonderoga. And it was a potent, unpretentious combination of hard apple cider, which makes sense, and a heavy pour of rum. So, anyway, I've never seen a Stone Fence. I never had one. Probably never will either, for that matter. But anyway, so 1791. So a friend of mine, a gentleman, Sidney N. Stokes, is middle. Everybody, some people know him as Chip. So Chip is everything Thomas Jefferson. So I've been privy to his collection, and he went around and photographed everything, every document that survives that Thomas Jefferson had anything to do with. And this document is very important. You can't read it, I can't read it, but I'll just tell you what it says. This is a declaration. It's the official consent from the state of New York for admission of Vermont into the Union, dated October 7th, 1790. It formally declares New York's consent that the community now actually exercising independent jurisdiction as the state of Vermont be admitted into the Union of the United States of America. It established the perpetual boundary line between, we had to give them some land, but basically the western bounds were going to be the townships of Pownell, Bennington, Shasberry, Arlington, Sandgate, Rupert, and Paulet, Wells, and Pulteney, going right up the western side of the state. When the Battle of Bennington was fought, and it was in Woolsack today, we say, well, the Battle of Bennington was fought in New York. Well, at the time, it was actually part of the New Hampshire grants, and that was some of the land we had to cede back. But it also stipulated that we must pay the sum of $30,000 by June 1st, 1794. $30,000 in the 1790s to be paid over 4 years was a staggering financial commitment. You know, it's basically kind of the equivalent of a modern state government taking on massive multi-million dollars in debt to just resolve its disputes and secure its borders. You probably wouldn't fly today, but this is what they had to do. And, you know, they did actually pay off the debt. And this is the letter that Jefferson sent to Governor Thomas Chittenden on February 28, 1791, telling him that, you know, Congress had basically admitted Vermont to the Union, and that the ratification for the proposed constitutional amendments. So that was the piece of paper that they had been waiting for all that time. That finally we were admitted to the Union. Another quick art break here. This is another Leroy Williams painting that was created for the Bennington Museum in 1938. It's called The Meeting at Faye's Tavern, or the Catamount Tavern. And the painting basically visualizes the June 1791 visit of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to Vermont shortly after it achieved statehood. And Jefferson standing there in the middle, the tall one in the middle. And Jefferson and Madison stayed at Elijah Dewey's Inn, now known as the Woonsock Inn, which is actually might have a shot at another life, which is pretty exciting. Mostly it was a vacation tour, but also serves as an opportunity for them to basically, you know, see, well, what is this state of Vermont? You know, Jefferson was basically the Secretary of State under George Washington, you know, our first president. And when Jefferson and Madison attended the Sunday services, the Reverend Job Swift was not a fan. You know, Jefferson was kind of a deist. Anybody ever read the Jefferson Bible? It's kind of interesting. He took a Bible and cut it all apart, took out all the miracles, and just kind of wrote it as what a man's, you know, his lessons. Well, that was a big no-no back then. But so Job refused to bow or show any of the customary deference that would be shown to visiting dignitaries. So it was a very cool reception. There's some other more colorful language I've read over people's, you know, what they thought has been passed down through, but. So he's given a pretty cool reception, and he went up through Lake George, up through Champlain, and it could be another great talk to do someday. But that's on the right is Elijah Dewey, who owned the Catamount Tavern, the Woonsock Inn at the time. Isaac Tickner, who was later the governor of Vermont, Jefferson in the middle, Madison, and then Governor Moses Robinson. So, you know, that's another painting you can actually see down there. This great art that was created by the Works Park Administration. It's really cool. And, you know, and then Jonas Fay, he actually wrote this letter back to Jefferson, basically following up on it. You know, Jefferson was very interested in maple seeds because he really wanted, because, you know, basically, you know, sugar was very popular up here in the colonies, and sugar was produced by by slaves, and he wanted to find something that we would need to. So this is basically Fay writing to him saying, I love the idea. Here's when you need to actually get some of the maple seeds. I'll send some down to you. I'm going to plant a whole maple orchard, and he was just very inspired to try to get all of Bennington to plant maple trees to produce maple sugar. And today, Vermont, of course, is still very well known for its maple syrup. And you can actually go to Jonas Fay's grave in Old Bennington at the Center Cemetery, which is the oldest cemetery in town. This is actually a photo that Mark Bushnell took of it. And on his stone actually says, author of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Vermont, which, just amazing. I mean, Fay probably needs a book of his own. And if you do go down there to see him, you could actually go by and see Robert Frost, who's just down over the hill a little ways from there. I had a lover's quarrel with the world. It's one of the greatest epitaphs I've ever read. So speaking of a little bit of literature, so the first mention of Manchester is this little thing that was written and published in London in 1797. It says, in summer there is such an equal serenity of weather at Manchester that one has scarce the power of wishing for a change. It is neither too hot nor cold. And even in July and August, which are here the most sultry months of the year, the kind breezes which whisper among the trees and pass between the mountains refresh the weary traveler, and render this place, if I might venture to use such an expression, the habitat of zephyrs. The value of land is 2 guineas to 30 guineas per acre. The land prices have gone up. So here's a question, I'm kind of coming down. It's 6:49. Thank you all for tolerating this has just been a fascinating journey for me. Where did they camp, right? I mentioned how many, thousands of militia were here. You think we'd know where they camp, right? Where did they camp? Well, they were here in Manchester. They were all here. I mean, there were letters written. I mean, they were here in Manchester. Well, where did they camp? There was only really one main road. So, in 1900, the Historical Society tried to figure out, they brought together a bunch of the old timers, and this is two of, I think, a couple more pages that Sarah Cleghorn wrote. A little bit of he said, they said. So I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but here's how it goes. Judge Fullerton, he said the camp was on the side hill by the Isham House in Ormsby Hill, or the swamp in the rear, and then the Bullis Slocum oral history, Sarah, the Bullis. Fullerton based his claims on one authority of Joseph Slocum, a living resident who recalled his mother and grandfather, Mr. Bullis, pointing out the exact spot. Slocum's mother remembered the encampment with particular distinctness because some chickens, which were her property and by which she intended to earn herself a new dress, were confiscated by the soldiers. And her father was deprived of a pair of oxen by them, which they were killed and used for rations. And then there was further disagreement. Mr. Russell Dean maintained that the regiment encamped on the hillside south of Ormsby Hill, while Cyrus Roberts disagreed with all of the above, and Mr. Swift remained unconvinced by any of it. So where did they camp? I don't know. We know. So the 3 X's at the bottom, I know this is probably a little hard to see. There's a circle of the equinox. This is basically Main Street. There are 3 X's are basically along those places which were described. And then we'll add some confusion. Where's that top X? Well, that's where we are right now. Because we have this wonderful powder hoard in our collection, which was an early gift to the Historical Society from the Lathrop family, that's inscribed, made in the year 1764 by William Ferris, his mark. And it was found on the Purdy Farm, which is the Arts Center, where General Stark's troops camped. So there you have it. They were here, and the answer is they probably camped all over the place. We think, it would have been a nice, neat little rows. They would have camped wherever there was a spring. In Equinox, as I'm sure some of you are aware, and people who have gone through Equinox Preservation Trust, there are springs everywhere. And some of the springs that were there weren't there then, and there were more then than there are now, and it just depends on how much rain there was. But the militias would have found a place to camp where there was water. And they wouldn't have been just all nice and neat packed up down Main Street, but they would have gone down Main Street, and they would have come in through the north along West Road, because, Route 7 going up through that didn't exist. So anyway, so if you come up to me and you say, well, where did they camp? I don't know. What do you want to hear? But they were definitely here. So what happened to all the boys? Christopher Roberts, who I mentioned, who was the third man into Fort Ticonderoga, he was 22 years old when that happened. This is 20 years later. This is one of the documents in 1795 where he was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the Vermont militia, at age 42. He ultimately rose to the rank of general, a well-regulated militia. That was a real thing. We really, that was law, that was order, were our militias. Following the close of the revolution and our path to statehood, a lot of the boys, they would have disbanded as an active military regiment. They would have gone back to their lives. Some of them stayed in the militias. They would have, and they would have gone west. They just all kind of, they just kind of went their own ways. But, how is the revolution? How is it honored in today's streetscape? We have this wonderful marker, which I'm not going to read to you, which is basically kind of one long paragraph explaining everything that I just explained to all of you here the last hour and 20 minutes. The Marsh Tavern, directly across the street, by the way, the sign for the Marsh. So you could go have yourself a meal there. It's on the wrong end of the hotel. The Marsh Tavern was on the southern end. This is on the northern end. That's me nitpicking. Makes me crazy. The Equinox Resort, established 1769. The Marsh Tavern was there in 1769, not the Equinox. But as my friend Dave Cannell would say, why let facts get in the way of a good story or a good marketing opportunity? So the Equinox established 1769. That's a little bit of a stretch. The Equinox actually wasn't established until 1853. But I'm nitpicking. But we have this wonderful soldiers monument, which, speaking of the Equinox, and Franklin Orvis, he put together this association to erect this beautiful monument. Where is this monument? This beautiful monument. Well, here's a great painting. Another little art stop. This is actually, I have Bartlett Arkell thinks this. The name can be found, around the campus, and we were sitting in the Arkell Pavilion, his widow. I went over to the Arkell Hall. I went over to Canajoharie, and this is work depicting the Soldiers Monument in front of the Congregational Church by American Impressionist Daniel Garber. When I went over to visit the Arkell Hall Foundation, and they have a beautiful senior living facility, I went over there in 2017, and you walk through the halls of this facility, and it is like walking through the permanent collection of the Southern Vermont Art Center. It's just absolutely astonishing. I had a little black and white picture of this that I found in the collection, and when I walked around the corner and saw this, it's massive. It's like a 5 foot by 4 foot. I saw it, I almost passed out. I couldn't believe how big it was and how beautiful it is. And this is just me taking a picture with my cell phone camera. Does no justice. But yeah, so yeah. And Bartlett Arkell met, because I looked and I said, well, was Daniel Garber, was he? I couldn't find any connection, but I did find out that actually he met him through connections through the Macbeth Gallery where Garber was exhibiting in 1910. And Arkell commissioned him for a number of works, including this, which I'd love to have back here. I don't think I could talk Lyman into repatriating this one, though. So even though it's really a kind of an impressive, imposing piece, it's kind of dwarfed by the church steeple. So the Soldiers Monument, there it is. Here it is on its own. Mostly crafted here in Manchester at Fullerton's Marble Works. This is a picture of 9 teams of horses in 1896 bringing just the base. This is down at RK Miles in the depot. You can go buy lawn furniture over there where that piece of granite is sitting. This is just the base, just that bottom piece. 9 teams, And then that originally it was going to be a Civil War standard bearer at the top of the column. And then Orvis died in 1900. No one took up the cause. They almost took the whole thing down because they were like, they couldn't figure out how they wanted to do it. But thankfully in 1905, they decided they were going to put basically a likeness of Ethan Allen up there. So, on the right-hand side is ours. And on the left-hand side is the 1876 version of Ethan Allen that's actually in the Capitol Rotunda at the U.S. Capitol. So the Capitol kind of got a more robust Ethan Allen. And this is when Fullerton was when they were putting the statuary up on top. I just love the scaffolding, right? OSHA would just love to see something like that today. When they put it up, Fullerton supposedly said to somebody who was passing by, which way should he face? And they said west towards the Yorkers. So when you drive by there and look, Ethan Allen is facing west. And when they had the dedication on July 4th, 1905, and it was a big. The governor was here. There was about 1,000 people here. There was school kids. It was kind of like the opening of the wing that we had here a couple weeks ago. People everywhere. And Ethan's legend continued to be built. Route 7. This is a 1932 the pamphlet by the Manchester, the chamber. It would have been Route 7, an all hard, it was concrete, surface from Pownell to the Canadian border, named for Ethan Allen when the highway opened in 1930. You know, when they did it was a huge celebration. They had a parade. I have so many pictures of some of the floats in it, and this is a picture looking up Main Street. You know, the combination cache there is on the right, which is the Mountain Goat today. And whoever took this picture was basically standing on the little porch roof of the bookstore today, the Colburn House, and they took this picture looking up Main Street. Then he kind of moved a little to the left and took another shot, and Peggy Lincoln Beckwith, who was, Robert's granddaughter, she flew her plane over and to commemorate the opening. And that's her standing in front of her 1929 Fleet Model 1 biplane with Ethan Allen IV. Now, Ethan didn't go out in the plane because those are actually some snippets from her flight log. I was like, I wonder if he went up in the plane. Well, according to her flight log, she was solo. And so the paved roads, that was really catching on in the 30s. And we started paving Bonnet Street in 1931. The red arrows point towards the Colburn House, which is now the North Shire Bookstore, just to give you a little bit of orientation. I mean, look at that piece of machinery, right? Holy smokes. And that's the bookstore there in the background. And basically, when this photograph was taken, if you would have turned around, you see this, which is still standing there today, which is the Seth Warner Memorial Highway. Has anybody ever noticed this? Yeah, a few people, yeah. Well, next time you go by, you're going to notice it. Basically, the Route 30 in Vermont was named the Seth Warner Memorial Highway by Vermont legislature in 1933. And it specifically identified the portion of the highway between Middlebury and Manchester, Vermont. So when you're driving up Route 30 going up through, you're on the Seth Warner Memorial Highway. And, the legend carries forward. I mean, our Vermont Air National Guard, the 158th Fighter Wing, they're holding one of those Green Mountain Boy battle flags in front of their Air Force F-35A Lightnings at the Amari Air Force Base in Estonia in July of 2022. And they're still known as the Green Mountain Boys. And, and the Green Mountain Boys, so the first Harrington that came here was in 1758. Came to Bennington. Apparently nobody left. I guess including me. So, so my friend Rebecca Allen, who's back there, Rebecca, wave, everybody turn around. I know that you all are here. So Rebecca is actually the president of the Descendants of the Green Mountain Boys, and she did my genealogy back there. I'm also a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, and our chapter, Vermont Sons of the American Revolution president, Tom Hughes, is actually sitting right next to her. Tom, wave to everybody. So there's Tom. So these are the people who make sure that we don't forget and how important it is. So... And Tom and Rebecca, they go all over the state and the community just trying to remind people of all the great people who actually, who stood up and tried to do the next right thing, all those many years ago. And, so it turns out, Bonnie, who I've known for 30 years and we're engaged, she's sitting here in the front row. She's also a descendant. And Rebecca discovered that going back about 9 generations, we're related. You don't have to do blood tests anymore to get married, right? So, anyway, so if you have any questions and you want to do any genealogy work, don't come see me. They're the people you want to go see. So, yeah. So this is kind of how I want to leave. So at the back of that monument is this bicentennial marker that used to be at the island, that little section there in front of the courthouse. So there's an island. In 1961, they set this bicentennial marker, and when they were doing all the work, putting in all the new water lines, they moved it. And I think Alan had a lot to do with that, but they moved it, and they left it there, thankfully, so you can actually see it. And it says, the bicentennial, 1761 to 1961. This historic crossroads, born of liberty and nurtured by the freedom-loving hub for wayfarers, host to generations, this pleasant land among the mountains. Thank you, everybody. And my hat's off for you sitting there for 90 minutes. I think these chairs were probably more comfortable than the ones that you would have been sitting in the... So thanks, Gloria.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you all for joining us. Before you leave, though, I want to just point out our next lecture is on Tuesday, July 14th. It's at 5:30. Our guest speaker will be Peter Galbraith, who is an author and former U.S. ambassador to Croatia. He will give his insights on a talk titled Iran and the Near East, War, Consequence, and the Uncertain Road Ahead. This will be held at Hildene in Lincoln Hall, and we hope to see you there. Tickets are available on our website. Thank you again.